Hi, we're Coronasaurus and we are a group of 5 PhD students from the universities of Bath and Exeter. This is our entry to the NERC COVID-19 Hackathon, and if you'd like to find out more, you can use the GitHub link in the description. This hackathon is looking at the positive and negative impacts of the COVID-19 lockdown and the recovery measures that have been put in place, and how we can learn from this to develop new strategies to meet our climate goals. For some context, these climate goals are based on the Paris Agreement, which aims to limit the global average temperature rise to 2 degrees C, and the UK has developed its own targets around this. The plot on the right-hand side shows those targets and our progress towards them so far, and you can see that we're making good progress, but there's a long way to go to become net zero by 2050. Our goal is to look at whether working from home and changing the working week might be one potential solution to reduce the UK's climate emissions significantly.
Okay, so we considered a range of data sources, including satellite and in situ measurements, to look at the variation in CO2 emissions during the lockdown period in the UK. However, natural climate variability causes masking of the anthropogenic signal in CO2 emissions, meaning that it's quite difficult to interpret these measurements in near real time. Luckily, we came across this publication, which you can see at the bottom of the slide here, by Lecker et al., who realized that there's been a huge drop in CO2 emissions, both globally, but also at the country level. And you can see in the right-hand figure, these are the drops in CO2 emissions for the United Kingdom. You can see we've experienced a peak drop in April 2020, where emissions have dropped by up to just under 31%. And here you can see the CO2 emissions by sector, where you can observe the panel in green showing CO2 emissions for the transport sector, which are the ones that experienced the most considerable drop during the period of lockdown. This is globally, it's not just the United Kingdom. Okay, so in order to be able to figure out, in order to be able to figure out what sectors need to be targeted, we need to understand which sectors produce the most CO2 emissions, which you can see in this figure are transport, energy, business, and the residential sector. So the questions that we're trying to address are: how does lockdown impact traffic volume? How does it impact energy demand? And how does it impact society?
Okay, so as Christina noticed, the highest drop in the pollution, in the CO2 emissions, was caused by the reduction of the traffic. And this was the result that was observed for the global emissions. And we would like to take a closer look at the situation in the UK. How did the traffic change in the UK and how did the emissions change? So we use the data describing the traffic divided into different modes of transport. For example, cars, LCVs, AGVs, rail, and buses. Here you can see how they change in time during the lockdown, where 1 is the number representing the traffic, standard traffic before the lockdown. Here, 3 events were marked. The 16th March is the day where the first restrictions were introduced. On 23rd March, the national lockdown was announced. And on the 13th May, the lockdown started to be being eased by allowing the people to meet more often from different households, among other things. So what we did with this data is, first we estimated what is the drop of CO2 emissions caused by each of those modes of transport. And we can clearly see that the highest drop was caused by the reduction of the car traffic. Just afterwards, we have LCVs and AGVs. The reduction of the rail and the buses was also huge. However, their total the total number of their emissions is not high comparable to the emission caused by the cars, LCVs and AGVs. And on the pie charts on the right, you can see that the percentage emission caused by the cars dropped significantly during the lockdown. So, to better understand how different phases of the lockdown impacted the change of the traffic, we built an interrupted linear model. This is a linear model in which we have some events which may, first of all, change the volume of the traffic, and secondly, can change the gradient with which the traffic is increasing or decreasing each day. The details, we present the details in our documentation. If we look at the results, we can see, we can obtain different sorts of conclusions for the cars, AGVs, LCVs, and also the mass transport, the rails and the buses, and also for the London Tube. So the first important conclusion is that after introducing the first restrictions, the traffic started to drop gradually. The highest drop, however, happened when the national lockdown was announced, and during the national lockdown, we can observe a little bit different behavior for cars, AGVs, LCVs, which tend to gradually increase on their number increases on the roads, while the mass transport remains on a very low level all the time. And the final conclusion that we obtained from our analysis is that when the easing was introduced, when the restrictions started to be eased, then we observed that the rate with which the cars, AGVs and LCVs appear on the roads tend to be slightly higher than during the full lockdown, which we can observe here on the graph on the left.
Okay, so we took some data from the national grid that describes the demand all over the UK, electricity demand. And as you can see from the black data points, which describe the energy data over 5 years, there is some sort of seasonal cycle where the energy rises in the winter and it drops in the summer. And then the red data points describe some energy demand after the lockdown. So we have modeled the data from before the lockdown using a Gaussian process regression with two different covariance kernels. One to describe the trend. As you can see, the energy is gradually dropping over the years, and one to describe the seasonal variation, which is this cyclical effect that you can observe. And if you're more interested in how the model works, we have submitted a notebook where you can explore the model in detail. But I will just quickly summarize what the results are. As you can see, all the measurements after the lockdown are lower than expected. The blue line describes the mean expectation, and while you always observe some data points below the mean, all the data points of the lockdown have been below the mean. And that's even clearer if we plot the relative energy use. That means how much energy have we used compared to what we would expect to use. That's the lower plot, where we can see that we've used less than expected according to the model during the lockdown, and for even for some data points, the expected use is outside the confidence bounds of our model. So the conclusion is that consumers and businesses have drawn less energy from the national grid during lockdown than we would expect. We also looked at some grid and gas data from the consumer side of things. And this data we got from Octopus Energy's website, where they have published some graphs, and we passed the data from the graph and did our own analysis on it. So what you can see on the left is data for each half hour over 7 weeks during the pandemic or during the lockdown, where 1 week was missing data, unfortunately. And what you see on the right is the total daily consumption. That is total daily consumption average for these 150,000 households where the data was collected from. So what this shows is the dashed line would be the expected use or typical use of a household, and the black line is the actual average use. So as you can see, the mean is just about the typical value. And the same goes for the gas use. The mean of the actual use is very close to the typical use. Now, the blue line shows the temperature. And as you can see, that's inversely correlated with the use. We've also included the R values, the correlation value between temperature and grid and gas use. As you can see, the gas use, that's the top plot, it's very highly correlated with the temperature, and the electricity use is quite correlated, which means that probably some people have electrical heaters and you maybe spend some more time indoors when the weather is bad. So the conclusion here is we have used as much energy as normal during the lockdown, and the variations that you see are mostly explained by temperature variations.
So coming on to the population, how did they react to lockdown, and what can we learn from these reactions to when we may have to introduce measures for climate change? Well, on the left-hand side, we've got reactions of people asking for and receiving help. Yes, anxiety levels went up through the roof when the lockdown happened. There were lots of people asking for assistance and receiving assistance. But over time, civil society met those needs, especially those survival needs of food, housing, healthcare, and the levels of requests went down. When looking at the population on how happy they were and their anxiety levels throughout lockdown, in fact, people were tended to be relatively happy with their life. They felt worthwhile. However, there were high anxiety levels, but over time, they went down and were addressed. So people are adaptable to change, and civil society will tend to step in and make sure people thrive, or at least survive. So overall, our project was looking at, the effect of lockdown. Certainly CO2 came down, and surface transport was the highest emitter there. And so we saw sort of 40 to 60% reduction in CO2 levels through this reduction in traffic. People worked from home, people lived at home, they had to change their lives. And we saw a relatively significant drop in demand for energy. And on the social population side of things, people get used to change. They will deal with it. They will be anxious, but people will get over it, and civil society will step in to deal with that. Okay, so Team Coronasaurus' solutions for the future. We're looking at a 4-day working week, which embraces 2 days of home working and 2 days at the office. Where we see this leading to is a reduction in daily traffic load, which will have a significant impact on the atmospheric CO2 load. We'll see a decrease in loading on the public transport system. The flexibility that home working brings will bring benefits to the employment labour market, and also will bring improved health for workers with this flexibility. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.